Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to my lecture recital. My name is Alec Villars Huntley, and this is a doctoral lecture recital that accompanies my recently completed dissertation. This presentation is a little unusual since circumstances dictate the absence of a live audience. I'm speaking to a mostly empty room. To those of you who are watching this streamed live, thank you so much for tuning in. And to those of you watching this recording sometime in the future, hello. I hope things in the future are going well. Life has been a little rough for most of us here in October 2020. Luckily, I have the privilege of being able to speak for some time about a subject utterly unrelated to the trials of our time. I get to spend the next hour talking about music. In particular, I'm here to discuss the subject of my dissertation entitled The Guaraldi Sound, the musical devices that characterize Vince Guaraldi's improvisational and compositional idiom. This presentation will be in 3 parts, each separated by a musical performance intended to demonstrate some of the ideas I'll bring up during the lecture segments. In part 1, I'll introduce you to Vince Guaraldi, and I'll describe his musical background and his many stylistic influences. In the second part of this presentation, I'll discuss a few of Guaraldi's improvisational and compositional idioms, the licks, phrases, chord progressions, and other features that help define Guaraldi's musical style. I'll describe them, name them, and play you several examples of each. In the third part of this presentation, I'll raise a few questions about Guaraldi's lasting legacy, focusing on the disparity between, on the one hand, the rather impressive financial and popular success he achieved during his lifetime, and on the other hand, the lukewarm reception he seems to hold among mainstream jazz critics and historians today. So who was Vince Guaraldi and why should you care? Vince Guaraldi was a jazz pianist whose recording career began in 1951 and lasted until his death in 1976. He lived his entire life in and around San Francisco, California, and unlike most West Coast jazz musicians of the 1960s, he was quite popular, and he made a good deal of money. Much of his financial and popular success stemmed from his hit albums and his work with the Peanuts franchise. Yes, he's the musician who wrote and performed the original music for the Peanuts animated shorts. For that reason, I suspect that even many of you who are unfamiliar with Guaraldi's name are nevertheless familiar with his music. Maybe you recognize this song. You might also be familiar with his most successful album, which you might be surprised to learn is the second best-selling jazz album of all time. That's right. Many of you likely already know that Miles Davis's album Kind of Blue is the best-selling jazz album of all time. But in second place is Vince Guaraldi's classic, A Charlie Brown Christmas. To date, this album has sold more than 4 million copies, and it remains profoundly popular, perhaps becoming only more popular with time. Despite being released in 1965, it first reached the #1 spot on a Billboard chart in 2008. And it peaked again at #1 as recently as January 17 of this year, 2020. Frankly, A Charlie Brown Christmas likely introduced millions more children to jazz than any other album ever has. I was one of these children, and I suspect that many of you watching were too. But while Guaraldi is likely remembered today mostly for his work with the Peanuts franchise, this was just one aspect of his career. Throughout his life, Guaraldi was also an active musician within his local San Francisco Bay Area community. He performed and recorded with many other reputable jazz stars of his time, and he released several albums of original music. Further, as I argue in my dissertation, and I hope to at least partially convince you of tonight, Guaraldi accomplished what many in the jazz community identify as a crowning artistic achievement. He developed a unique, identifiable, and deeply personal musical style. It's a style that, though perhaps simple when compared to that of other jazz trendsetters of the 1960s, was nevertheless fun, accessible, and refreshingly unpretentious. It's a style that brings smiles to the faces of his fans, defined the music of one of the most successful existing franchises, and remains a cultural touchstone of the winter holiday season for millions of families. It's a style that many commentators in reviews, histories, and liner notes have referred to as the Guaraldi sound. Substantial insight into the Guaraldi sound can be gleaned by noting the various kinds of music that influenced Guaraldi over the course of his life. His style, like that of all musicians, was both a product of its time and a reflection of his myriad influences. I'll briefly discuss several of these influences chronologically. Then, in the second portion of this presentation, I'll point out some specific Guiraldian devices that these influences generated. Vince Guiraldi's first major stylistic influence was boogie woogie, a style of blues piano playing characterized by driving ostinato bass lines played by the pianist's left hand. Boogie woogie first emerged as a distinct style in the 1920s, but it achieved widespread popularity in the 1930s and continued to be popular well into the 1940s when Guiraldi was a teenager and practicing his instrument. To give you a sense of what the genre sounds like, here's a clip from a 1936 rendition of one of the most influential boogie-woogie recordings, Honky Tonk Train Blues by Meade Lux Lewis. Pay attention to the repeating rhythmic bass line played by Lewis's left hand and to the bluesy riffs he plays above that with his right hand. In high school, Guiraldi achieved some popularity among his peers by playing boogie-woogie piano at parties. He acknowledged this influence years later, crediting several popular boogie-woogie pianists as musical inspirations. Jimmy Yancey was a great early influence on my playing, he said. Also Albert Ammons and Pete Johnson, but it was Yancey's way of handling the blues that really grabbed me. As I'll discuss in more detail later, boogie-woogie forms a vital part of the Guiraldi sound. And the second tune we'll be performing for you this evening, Treat Street, provides a clear example of this influence. But Guiraldi was first and foremost a jazz musician, and it's from mainstream jazz, especially the flavor that was developed during the 1950s in California, that most of his performance practices derive. He was an active participant in what jazz historian Ted Gioia describes as the second wave of West Coast jazz, which crested in the mid-1950s and ebbed about a decade later. Its popularity buoyed the careers of West Coast performers like Dave Brubeck, the Lighthouse All-Stars, the Jerry Mulligan and Chet Baker Quartet, and Cal Tjader. And as the album artwork on the screen might make apparent, it was a wave that marketers publicized as cool, laid back, and lighthearted. Guiraldi's first recordings were made in 1951 as a member of Cal Tjader's group. For much of this decade, Guiraldi's sound was most clearly influenced by the dominant jazz piano trends of his time, the bebop stylings pioneered by the likes of Bud Powell and taken up and developed by Oscar Peterson, Wynton Kelly, Red Garland, and so many others. During the 1950s, Guiraldi performed and recorded with jazz stars like Eugene Wright, Stan Getz, Scott LaFaro, Chico Hamilton, and Bill Holman. He toured as a member of Woody Herman's big band and even played for 8 months as a member of the Lighthouse All-Stars. Further cementing his jazz credentials, in 1964 he toured with Benny Goodman, and in the 1970s, his trios included drummers Elliot Zygmunt, later a member of Bill Evans's trio, and Mike Clark, later a member of Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. Jazz influenced the Guiraldi sound in more ways than I can list, but here are a few clear ones. First, he played and recorded jazz standards. His first 2 albums include compositions by George Gershwin, Duke Ellington, Billy Strayhorn, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, and John Lewis. Second, the compositions he wrote and played mostly used standard jazz harmony, chords with 4 or more notes whose roots move around the cycle of fourths and create a lot of 2-5-1 progressions. One of the chord progressions I identify as a Guiraldi idiom in my paper, the tritone walk-down, is also common in the broader jazz dialect. Third, most of his recordings, including most of his original compositions, and even most Peanuts tunes, use a head form, which you can think of as a kind of improvisation sandwich. First, the head, the composed melody, is played, then the musicians take turns improvising over the same chord progression, and then the head is played again. Fourth, Guiraldi plays mostly like a bebop-era jazz musician. He plays melodies 1 note at a time in his right hand and accompanies himself with punctuating chords in his left hand. And finally, Guiraldi loved to swing. In the jazz vernacular, this means he and his band frequently played a groove strongly associated with jazz music. It's based on a grid of uneven eighth notes. The bassist plays a walking pattern, 1 note per beat, and the drummer plays a kind of spang-spang-a-lang pattern on the ride cymbal. Even on compositions in which the head is played with a different groove, Guaraldi abruptly starts swinging for the solo sections. Another major influence on the Guaraldi sound was Afro-Cuban music. For much of the 1950s, Guaraldi was a member of the band of Cal Tjader, a musician who pursued parallel careers in both straight-ahead and Afro-Cuban jazz, the kind of music that might at the time have been generically called mambo and what is today often generically called salsa. Tjader's first album as a leader features Guaraldi playing piano on tracks like Chopsticks Mambo, whose title accurately suggests its Afro-Cuban influences. And a recording from 1956 titled Live at Club Macumba, San Francisco, captures the group playing entire sets of Afro-Cuban dance music. By 1959, when Guaraldi left Tjader's group, Afro-Cuban rhythms and harmonies had fully seeped into the Guaraldi sound. The clearest examples of this influence are likely Guaraldi's frequent use of montunos and four-chord vamps common in this style. I'll discuss both of these in more detail later. The next major influence on the Guaraldi sound was bossa nova. In 1959, the film Black Orpheus was released to worldwide acclaim. It featured music by now legendary Brazilian composers Luis Bonfa and Antonio Carlos Jobim. It was also likely the spark that ignited the subsequent bossa nova craze of the 1960s. Guaraldi loved the movie. He saw it multiple times, he owned the soundtrack, and he dedicated his third album as a leader to the music from the film. Here's a video clip from a 1964 documentary that shows Guaraldi describing his being influenced by Black Orpheus. Guaraldi is the one with the giant handlebar mustache. For a brief moment, you'll also see Max Weiss, co-founder of Fantasy Records, wearing a fur hat and claiming that he inspired Guaraldi to record the music from the film.
Black Orpheus music, how did you get interested in that?
I saw the movie a few times, and I had the soundtrack.
Did you dig the soundtrack?
Yeah, I dug the soundtrack. I dug Samba de Orpheus. That was the first tune I dug. I dug the tune and the scene in the movie, that part. And then I had the soundtrack, and I just kind of put it together. I was playing Samba de Orpheus quite a long time before I even bothered to put it together. And Fantasy Records always wanted someone to do it.
I may have told him to go see the movie, and then I found out that he had seen it first. But anyhow, I told him to go see the movie.
They had it in the back of their mind, someone, would make a good album. And,
jazz versions of it, you mean?
Not necessarily just jazz, just someone do something with it,
Then did they suggest it to you?
Well, they mentioned, they didn't suggest. In fact, when I told them I had a jazz impressions of it, they were kind of surprised about it. Because they didn't even think of it as a jazz thing.
Yeah.
The album Guaraldi recorded, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus, was a breakout success, and it served as the catalyst for many of his future opportunities. The album sold more than 300,000 copies within the first 2 years of its release, and it peaked at number 24 on Billboard's 100 Top LPs chart in 1963. This was largely due to the success of one of two original compositions on the album, titled Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Cast Your Fate to the Wind peaked at number 22 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and earned Guaraldi a Grammy Award for Best Original Jazz Composition. To my ears, the recordings on Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus marked the first appearance of the Guaraldi sound in full maturity. Nearly every one of the idiomatic musical devices I identify in my dissertation can be heard on this album. With that in mind, I'd like to take this opportunity to perform Cast Your Fate to the Wind for you, just to give you a sampling of the Guaraldi sound. And while I'll soon discuss in detail some of the idiomatic devices that this composition demonstrates, for now, I'd like you to pay attention to just a few things. Notice first the prominence of a composed bass line during the head. Second, the simple repeating chord progression during the solos. Third, the abrupt switch to a swing groove for the solos. And fourth, the trademark lick that the piano solo begins with. To help me perform this piece, I'm joined by my friends Dr. Stephen Hefner on the bass and Stephen Starks on the drums. Without further ado, here is Cast Your Fate to the Wind. In a 2014 essay, jazz scholar Benjamin Given employed a framework established by Leonard Meyer to study the musical vocabulary of Sonny Rollins and Rollins's contemporaries. Meyer's framework establishes 3 levels of musical vocabulary analysis: dialect, idiom, and intra-opus style. To closely paraphrase Given, a dialect is a set of musical attributes or techniques associated with a number of composers or improvisers within a genre. These musicians who share a dialect may also have individual approaches called idioms. And finally, any given piece of music has its own intra-opus style, consisting of features that are replicated within a single work or, by extension, within a jazz improvisation. Guaraldi was a jazz musician, and by definition, jazz musicians use techniques associated with a common jazz dialect. But since my study was intended to identify the musical attributes that characterize Vince Guaraldi's individual sound, what distinguishes him from other jazz musicians, I mostly sought to identify his idiom. There is, of course, some overlap between dialect and idiom. None of the idiomatic devices I discuss are exclusive to Guaraldi's playing, and Guaraldi also played some phrases from the jazz dialect with such frequency that they can be said to constitute part of his personal idiom. I only have time in this presentation to describe a few of the devices that my paper covers in more detail. I'll focus on the ones that our performances tonight most clearly demonstrate, including those that you might have noticed on Cast Your Fate to the Wind. First, you may have noticed that the melody of Cast Your Fate to the Wind was played using 2 notes at once. The technical musical term for 2 notes played at once is a dyad. Guaraldi played dyads a lot. This likely derived from his boogie-woogie background, as dyads and more elaborate right-hand phrases are common in that style. The practice of playing mostly 1 note at a time with the right hand, especially when soloing, emerged during the bebop era. And while this was how Guaraldi played most of the time, his frequent use of dyads was highly idiomatic. He played them while improvising, and he wrote them into his compositions. His composition Masked Marvel provides examples of both. Listen to this excerpt from the head of the Masked Marvel and observe that the melody played in Guaraldi's right hand is composed almost exclusively of dyads. Now listen to this excerpt from his solo, which, again, consists mostly of dyads. As an aside, The Masked Marvel is one of 3 recordings for which I transcribed the piano part in full. The transcription is available as an appendix on my dissertation. A special case of a dyad, which in my paper I refer to as a double stop, is particularly indicative of the blues piano idiom. The term double stop derives from a technique on string instruments like violin and cello, in which 2 notes are bowed at once. On the piano, this term can be used to describe a technique common in blues and boogie-woogie piano playing, in which 2 notes are played at once, the top note is held or repeated, and the bottom note changes. Here's an example of Guaraldi playing a series of fairly typical bluesy double stops on a 1956 recording of his original composition, Fenwick's Farfel. There's one kind of double stop in particular that Guaraldi plays with such frequency that it constitutes perhaps the single most idiomatic lick in his vocabulary. In my paper, I call it the minor third double stop. Guaraldi plays a perfect fourth, then slides the bottom note up 2 half steps to form a minor third. I suspect many of you have heard Guaraldi play this before. It features prominently in his most famous composition, the Peanuts song, Linus and Lucy. Listen to this short clip from one of the first recordings of that tune. The lick you hear in between the chordal hits is a minor third double stop. Examples of Guaraldi playing his signature minor third double stop abound. He plays it on nearly every recording that he made after 1957. Why 1957? My best guess is that he discovered the technique while playing Willow Weep for Me, which he first recorded that year with Cal Tjader, then the very next day with his own trio. Listen to the way he interprets the melody of this tune with minor third double stops on the former recording from a medley with Cal Tjader. The minor third double stop is maybe the single most idiomatic lick I discuss in my dissertation. At times, it constituted nearly all of the thematic material for Guaraldi's improvised solos. For example, on his recording of Samba de Orpheus from Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus, I counted more than 50 occurrences of this lick. Guaraldi only plays for roughly 5 minutes on this recording, so that averages out to one minor third double stop every 6 seconds. Here are a few such instances. Here's the first. Here's the second. Here's the third. And here's the fourth. Another idiomatic feature of Guaraldi's compositions that you may have noticed on Cast Your Fate to the Wind was a bass line played by my left hand on the piano. On many of his pieces, these bass lines are just as important to the identity of a piece as the melody that plays above it. Remember Linus and Lucy? The bass line alone is enough to recognize it. Guaraldi's prominent use of composed bass lines represents another clear influence of boogie woogie on his idiom. His composition Play It Again, Charlie Brown, for example, draws clear inspiration from Meade Lux Lewis, Jimmy Yancey, and Guaraldi's other early influences. Listen to this clip from his solo on this track, and notice the similarities between the left-hand pattern he plays here and the one from Honky Tonk Train Blues, which I played for you earlier as an example of classic boogie woogie. Those of you familiar with A Charlie Brown Christmas might recognize the following excerpt from his composition Skating. Though the bass line here is not complicated, he plays it in unison with his bassist, indicating that it was composed and compositionally important. In fact, even when a bass line doesn't seem to be prescribed by the composition, Guaraldi sometimes can't seem to help himself. This is sort of the opposite of the approach of Bill Evans, for example, who famously left substantial room for his bassists to improvise. Listen to what Guaraldi plays with his left hand on this excerpt from his solo on Skating. And if you can, also pay attention to the chord progression here, since I'll be discussing that in just a moment. Skating uses a chord progression that Guaraldi probably became familiar with through Afro-Cuban music, like what he played with Cal Tjader in the 1950s. It's a repeating 4-chord progression, 1, 4, 5, 4, and it shows up all the time in Guaraldi's compositions. It's one of the most common progressions in Afro-Cuban dance music, where it might either persist throughout the whole track or only occur during the middle mambo section, loosely analogous to a solo section in a jazz arrangement. As but one example of many, listen to this excerpt from the beginning of Oscar de Leon's Que Bueno Baila Usted. You'll hear the pianist open the piece with a repeating pattern called a montuno, though nomenclature sometimes differs here. Now compare that progression to the one Guaraldi used for the solo section of another well-known composition from his Christmas album entitled Christmas is Coming. I'll play one more example of this progression. This one comes from Guaraldi's composition, Detained in San Isidro. In this clip, you might also observe that throughout, Guaraldi plays a composed boogie-woogie-inspired bass line, and in this excerpt, he improvises playing mostly dyads. Now I'd like to perform another piece for you that rather conspicuously demonstrates many of the idiomatic techniques I've discussed in the last several minutes. You'll hear a constant left-hand bass line on the piano, a melody that uses mostly dyads, harmony consisting of a 1-4-5-4 progression, the occasional minor third double stop, and even chordal hits in a rhythm derived from the Afro-Cuban musical form cha-cha-cha. Without further ado, here is Vince Guaraldi's composition, Treat Street, and I'm joined again by my friends Stephen and Stephen. There are several more idiomatic techniques that I discuss in my dissertation, and if you're interested in learning about them, I invite you to read it. But because my time for this presentation is limited, I want to instead take this opportunity to make some broader observations about Guaraldi's popularity and lasting reputation. I've already discussed his popularity among general audiences. He had a smash hit in Cast Your Fate to the Wind. His work for the Peanuts animated shorts is celebrated by fans of the franchise, and his Christmas album has become an American cultural icon. But did you know that he was also admired by jazz icons of his time? Not just Stan Getz, Benny Goodman, Mike Clark, Woody Herman, and the others he performed and recorded with, but also Dizzy Gillespie, who asked Guaraldi to sit in with his band on at least one occasion, and even the Dark Prince of Jazz himself, Mr. Miles Davis. In one of my favorite anecdotes from Derek Bang's comprehensive career study, Vince Guaraldi at the Piano, former Guaraldi bandmate Jerry Grinelli remembered Davis not only enjoying Guaraldi's music, but even asking Guaraldi to join his band, as he remembered. Most people don't know this, but Miles Davis loved Vince. He even wanted Vince to come work with him, but Vince refused, saying, "Nah, I already got a band, man." Anyway, Miles would come in every night and just sit there. He loved Vince's tune Star Song, so Miles would have a drink and say, "Play that song, man," every night. And it freaked me out because it was Miles, man. And yet, despite Guaraldi's popularity both during his lifetime and even today, his reputation within the contemporary jazz community is fairly tepid. His name is absent in nearly every jazz history book I've encountered during my tenure as a graduate student in this field. Even in Ted Gioia's excellent book, West Coast Jazz, Guaraldi is only discussed in 3 short paragraphs, and mostly as a side note to the discussion of Cal Tjader. Ethan Iverson, jazz pianist and professor at the New England Conservatory, seemed to express the jazz world's lukewarm feelings about Guaraldi in an article from The New Yorker, when he wrote, "Though Guaraldi's bebop lines were enjoyable, he lacked the fire of Hampton Hawes or the mystery of Jimmy Rawls." A week later, on his blog, Iverson seemed to apologize for having brought any attention to Guaraldi at all, writing, "Truthfully, I'm actually a little abashed about celebrating Guaraldi, for in no way is he a jazzer's jazzer. If you're talking about West Coast piano of a certain era, many serious fans love Hampton Hawes and Jimmy Rawls more than Vince Guaraldi." This seems like a somewhat unexpected fate for the musician responsible for creating the second best-selling jazz album of all time. And so I'd like to suggest a few reasons for Guaraldi's current lackluster reputation. First, I'll acknowledge that there is some truth to Iverson's claim that Guaraldi isn't a jazzer's jazzer. A significant portion of his output was, at best, tangential to the genre, and frankly, not all of it is very good. Further, the Guaraldi sound, despite its uniqueness, was not adopted by many future jazz musicians, so he's not today generally remembered as a trendsetter. But there are also some non-musical reasons that may partially explain Guaraldi's rather minor presence in contemporary jazz histories. I discussed several in my dissertation, but I'll note 3 here. First, jazz historians and critics may have a vested interest in portraying jazz in a reverent light. Although jazz today enjoys a reputation as lofty and sophisticated, that status was hard-won. And it contrasts profoundly with the genre's early reputation as licentious and plebeian. Perhaps for that reason, those who champion jazz as America's classical music are motivated to downplay the significance of jazz that's too accessible, unsophisticated, simple, or fun. For better or worse, a lot of Guaraldi's music could be described in this way, and his close association with the Peanuts franchise likely contributes to the perception that Guaraldi's music is not to be taken seriously. A second reason for Guaraldi's minor presence in jazz histories might be that he never lived in New York. As scholars David Ake and Ted Gioia have each noted, jazz historians have tended to emphasize the tastes of East Coast jazz musicians to the detriment of others whose styles reflect musical traditions from farther west and south. Guaraldi never moved far from his birthplace of San Francisco, and, to quote Ted Gioia, "With few exceptions, the musicians who went back east made the big reputations, while the players who stayed out west merely made music." Finally, Guaraldi's commercial success may have paradoxically hurt his future reputation. In an effort to elevate jazz's artistic status, some writers have sought to distinguish the genre from pop music. Towards that end, they may have downplayed the significance of jazz that was commercially successful. But an odd implication of this attitude is that authentic jazz, according to such writers, should not be popular. This is an attitude that many jazz musicians have had to contend with, most conspicuously those who in the 1970s played what we now call fusion. musicians as revered as Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, and Wayne Shorter were accused, directly or indirectly, of being sellouts and pandering to a mass audience. But the fraught relationship that jazz critics have with popularity predates fusion. Consider, as but one example of many, another musician who, like Guaraldi, was admired by Miles Davis, played groove-oriented and Latin-tinged arrangements, had a chart-topping hit album, but who was dismissed by some critics as a cocktail pianist whose music ought not to be considered jazz. I'm referring to Ahmad Jamal. That's right, Jamal, a pianist who is now widely accepted to be among the giants of jazz piano, was criticized harshly by reviewers of his tremendously popular breakout album, At the Pershing But Not For Me. As one reviewer in a 1958 issue of Downbeat wrote with obvious disdain, "Apparently this is being marketed as a jazz record." The reviewer continues, "Jamal plays a very good cocktail piano with praiseworthy musicianship," and he later describes Jamal's improvisation as some rather meaningless upper keyboard improvisational tinkling. I wonder, if Guaraldi had not become involved with Peanuts, not achieved such financial success, and not stayed on the West Coast, would Iverson still have been so quick to compare Guaraldi unfavorably to his contemporaries? Before I end with one final performance, I want to emphasize here that I'm not trying to argue that Guaraldi's music ought to be included within the mainstream jazz canon, or even that you ought to enjoy it. A canon is a social and historical construct, and taste is subjective. I do hope, however, that my study draws some attention to Guaraldi's laudable contributions to the field and demonstrates that he cultivated a unique musical idiom. That musical idiom is on full display in the final composition we'll be performing for you this evening, entitled Almaville. Along with Cast Your Fate to the Wind, this was one of two original compositions included on Guaraldi's breakout album, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus. It was also recorded on a 1969 album of the same name, the last studio album that Guaraldi published during his lifetime. In this piece, you'll hear elements of Afro-Cuban music, like the opening montuno, and the groove used during the B sections. You'll hear a bossa nova-inspired bass line during the A sections. You'll hear minor third double stops, and for the solos, we'll swing. Please enjoy our rendition of Vince Guaraldi's Almaville, and thank you so much for watching this presentation. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Those of you who are watching live, thank you. Those of you who are watching this video sometime in the future, thank you for watching. Thank you for getting this far in my presentation. That's it for the actual material, but I would like to spend a moment just thanking the people who have helped me put this dissertation together. First of all, my committee. I assume you are all watching right now. I think that's your job. Dave Meter, Andrew May, William Coppola. You have all been so helpful in this process. Thank you so much. My mentor professor, Professor Emeritus John Murphy, you helped me edit the paper. You gave me so many suggestions, and I just feel so lucky to have been able to work with you during my time here. I have expert consultants who I was able to correspond with by email and over the phone and video chat. Derek Bang is the author of Vince Guaraldi's, he calls it a career study, but it's the closest thing to a biography that currently exists. And I just emailed him out of the blue one day, and he seemed more than helpful, more than eager to help me. And we've been in email correspondence ever since. So Derek Bang, if you're watching, hello. Otherwise, hello sometime later. Similarly, George Winston, a very successful pianist, maybe Vince Guaraldi's biggest fan. Derek Bang put me in touch with George Winston, and George was incredibly helpful. I was able to give him very specific musical questions, email him for examples. Hey, can you think of a time when Guaraldi used a bass line on this progression? And he would just email back right away, and just incredible. My fellow DMA students, those of you in my class and 1 year ahead of me who I had classes with, first, Gregory Satterthwaite, Dr. Gregory Satterthwaite, if you're watching this, hello. It was just such a pleasure to have you in my cohort. But also Dr. Stephen Hefner, who was playing bass with us this evening, Dr. Colleen Clark, and Dr. Danielle Pinilla. Of course, my band, Stephen Hefner and Stephen Starks. Of course, you can't see them. They're off screen, but they're sitting right there. Thank you so much, both of you, for making this work. And to my family, my mom, Patrice Villars, my dad, Stuart Ratner, and to my wife, who's also sitting right there, Katie Poole, my most trusted editor, who had to read this paper so many times. I bet she wanted to claw her eyes out, but nevertheless was incredibly helpful. So I love you, Katie. Thank you very much for tuning in, and that's all.